2 spaces ahead of me before them. Until they die, I'm not going to despise mankind.
Are we going to name names, Howard? Or
To you.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's true. You know, I mean, I have the courage to be disliked.
Yes.
I do.
Yes. Which we like about you.
Well, I mean, comics is, for the most part, a business made up of nice people who aren't particularly good, who are lucky enough.
People who aren't particularly nice.
It's true. I'm situationally kind. I mean, I'm consistently kind to children because I shouldn't be the one to disappoint them. Their parents would do that job. But when I consider, as an example, the level of contempt, benign and bemused, but contempt nonetheless, that Stan Lee treated his colleagues and collaborators with. And one must also question, at least this one must also question, the potential that some of that contempt might have been had for you, the audience, or me as a member of that audience, because I mean, a lot of what informs Hey Kids Comics is the idea that comics as a profession has more in common with the Jesuitry than it does with, say, movie fandom or movie making or rock and roll making or any other kind of the popular culture things that attract people that are doable with your own hands. Comics is an inoculation. I was inoculated with comics when I was 4 years old. And I can still bring up a sense memory of the smell of that paper. I was given a box of comic books, a refrigerator box half filled with comics by 2 cousins. When, to this day, I don't know whether they were asked to get rid of them by their mother, as so many mothers do, or they felt they'd outgrown them at 7 and 10. And I had a Saul on the Road to Damascus experience with this material. I was completely and totally floored by it. And this was not, it was, in those days, in my generation, we were little boys. We read everything. You read comic books, you read comics, you read everything. And I read, it was Archie's and funny animal stuff, Little Lulus and superheroes. The horror stuff freaked me out. I could not deal with that shit at all. I'm a complete pussy. I couldn't even begin to look at it. But 2 things occurred. One specifically, I understood at 4 that someone made these things, that they simply did not become organically available to me. And 2, that I wanted to be one of those people. And by the time I was 5, I was reading on a 4th grade level. My mother, who was an astonishingly stupid woman, never understood that the reason I was so early a reader and so endemic a reader and so consistently a reader was the fact that I taught myself to read from comic books. And I think everyone in my family regarded my early reading as a kind of an anomaly, an odd genetic defect in a family of schmucks. And I loved comic books uncritically and unconditionally, as only a 5-year-old who loves comic books can. But not anymore, because many of you are 50 to 60 years old, and you still love this shit unconditionally. And I encourage you to take some fucking conditioning. All right? Well, I'm not going to rip a piece out of my comic book.
I hope not, because it's my copy.
Okay.
Howard, would you like an introduction? We never actually got to that.
Sure. I'm willing to hear me spoken about you.
Well, I'm sure if you're here, you're familiar with Howard Chaykin from such works as American Flag,
Star Wars, Satellite Stores. I mean, I don't deny the work I did in the 70s. That makes me ashamed of myself, but I did it. I can't get away from it.
and more recent works like The Divided States of Hysteria and
which made me even more disliked.
And the book we're here to talk about today, Hey Kids Comics, which is
about what I'm talking about.
Yeah, about what you're talking about. It's about the history of the comic book industry. It's sort of a Romana clef.
Well, it is in its most reductive. It's madmen in the comic book business. I worked in advertising in the era in which Mad Men is portrayed, and I know what they got right and I know what they got wrong. And I should explain that when I first decided to do this book, when I was asked to do this book, I put out an email, a sort of a post everywhere, for people to give me anecdotes that would perhaps potentially be part of the narrative. And every single thing I heard from everyone was a settling of scores, which I found really appalling.
The personal scores?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it was like name names and just like, you know, it was the equivalent. It was just like a stream of the equivalent of "fuck that guy," and it really it filled me with despair because that was the exact opposite of what I wanted to do. I did not want to do a venal, petty, small-minded book. I wanted to do a book about petty, venal, and small-minded people. And that's perfectly fair, but I wanted the book, as subjective as it is, because it is my work, and one cannot be objective about something that has had so profound an impact and effect on one's life. I wanted the book to have both an elegiac quality and a bitter quality as well. I spent a great deal of time in the company of my father's generation, the guys who were born in the 20s. I met Gil Kane for the first time when I was 13 years old. I went to work for him when I was 18, and I met a lot of people through him, and heard a lot of anecdotal material, people just talking, bitching, you know, settling scores, telling stories about what it was like. And you know, our business is a family of friends. You know, there's that inoculation starts early, and the people who were fictionalized in the Hey Kids comics are conflations of men and women that I knew. Some I didn't know personally, but knew by reputation. Many of them I did know personally. And my instinct was to talk about, well, back up a second. You know, I mean, any of you who have ever written anything professionally are often asked by non-writing editors, what is the theme of your work? And when an editor asks me that question, my reaction is similar to Mao's when he hears the word culture. I reach for my gun. Because theme is not, if one approaches the writing of a project with the assumption that you know the theme of it already, you've already lost the game. Theme is something that evolves and develops from the material as it evolves and develops itself. The theme it reveals itself, it exposes itself. And when I started this book, my first assumption what I was doing was an elegiac folk tale about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, Gil Kane, Lily Renee, Ted, Matt Baker, just characters in the narrative that informed my work and my childhood. But ultimately emerged from this material was the theme of this is the misunderstanding of one's own value. That the people who are characters in this book, and a lot of this theme evolved from the structure of the book that ultimately was defined. I opted to do a book that had a cold opening and a coda, which were directly connected, but their direct connection had more to do with Stephen Sondheim than James Patterson. Okay. One of Sondheim's greatest works that has never been produced well is something called Merrily We Roll Along, which is a show. It's a musical based on a George S. Kaufman play that starts at the end and ends at the beginning. And it is mispresented and misproduced endlessly. It's never been done right. And the cold opening takes place in 1972, and the coda takes place in 1939. And it's about the same people, and the misunderstanding of one's own value, and the bitterness that is accrued by that. And I was talking about this book with a dear friend of mine while I was in the midst of it, and I said that my generation didn't have that bitterness. And he said, of course not, because you knew what was going on when you came in. You know, sort of like what Super Chicken said to Fred, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it. And the generation that invented comic books, the guys who were children in the 1940s, all assumed this was a way station. This was a step toward another life, that things would change, that they would move on and get out of this. And then many of them woke up at the ages of 50 or 60 and found themselves doing the same shit they've been doing since they were 15 years old. Some of them were perfectly happy. Some of them were trapped by the fact that they had no other skills. And the level of the bitterness that evolved from that is deep and profound. When I was in my early career, I was 22. I signed a copy of Sort of Sorcery when I was at a show a couple of weeks back. And I looked at the date of the book, and I realized I was 21 years old when I drew that thing. 21. I'm 69 years old, okay? And I look good, but, you know, I'm fat, so. And I remember being in my early 20s at Marvel, when Marvel was first beginning to accept the fact that there were younger men available to work for their company. I ran into Mike Esposito. I mentioned Stephen Sondheim earlier. I take Sondheim very seriously in his perspective about speaking ill of the dead. I will always speak ill of the dead because they can't defend themselves and you can't hurt their feelings. Mike Esposito, I use the word, I never heard anyone use the word fan in relation to fandom in comics with such bile. His loathing just exuded from him in a single syllable. It was astonishing. And the contempt for the audience, even from a guy who, whether you know it or not, was a particularly creative force in the early 1950s. We know of his work mostly as a hack inker in the 60s and 70s until he died. But he was partnered with Ross Andru, who was another guy who became a hack, but whose work in the early 50s, he was one of the only guys who actually did material that imitated Kurtzman's Mad and did it well. These were doing some really interesting work. The writing sucked, but for the most part, most of the writing sucked in those days. I mean, one of the reasons that Eisner and Kurtzman stand out so much is it's compared to what? I mean, the writing was just astonishingly bad. So and much of that contempt for fandom was a self-directed contempt as well. The self-loathing involved of, well, were we doing this work that they always thought they would move on from. Okay. I met Gil Kane when I was 13, and I went to work for him 5 years later. We did not stay in touch. I just happened to find out that he needed somebody and went to see him. And his behavior, his sensibility, he clearly loved making the material, but he was clearly trapped in a set of parochial ideas that he could not break out of. And so much of that idea derives from the fact that they were paid so shittily and treated with such contempt that he couldn't slow down enough to find something idiosyncratic in the work. And in the long run, I've come to believe that one of the great failures of my career, and this sounds like self-flattery, but it's really not, is that my work is idiosyncratic. And idiosyncrasy does not serve well in the comic book business. Comic books are about a level of mediocrity that is safe, undemanding, and frequently pandering. And the work that these guys were called upon to do, mostly by men who treated their talent pools with complete contempt, was aimed at children. And these guys they didn't regard themselves as artists. In many cases, because of the Depression, they were the first and only breadwinners in their family until things started picking up with the Second World War. And the reason comic books in the 1940s are so shitty, I mean, the three major companies in the 40s were Quality, DC, and Timely. And when I was a Golden Age collector as a kid, I wasn't aware of the quality stuff. And the quality comics were the best comics in the 1940s, okay, because of Will Eisner. Now, I'm on record as saying how much I despise Will Eisner as a person. I found him loathsome. He was a guy who regarded anyone who was not him with contempt. But I also acknowledge the fact that Will Eisner basically invented comic books. He was the one who translated what had been a newspaper strip language into a page of comic books. He understood the real estate of the page. He understood how to move from one page to another. And I'm one of those people who's capable of acknowledging the excellence and brilliance of work while loathing the human being. And Alex Toth was a truly miserable human being, but the greatest comic book artist who ever lived, in my opinion. But we live in a business that personalizes everything, so there are people who cannot look at work that has excellence to it, because they cancel the work because of the talent behind it, which is absurd, but also perfectly acceptable and real in the context of comic books, because comic books has created this a false sense of family. You know, I bought into the whole Merry Marvel Martian Society as a kid, and significantly, I outgrew my feelings for this work as soon as I began working professionally. because the bitterness that was a miasma in the office of these old men, you know, men 20, 30 years younger than me now, but old men by the terms and standards of a 20-year-old, really informed the office. And I really wanted to convey that aspect of the business in the comic book, without undercutting the romance of the doing of the work. Comics history is filled with anecdote. I had to do the story of the guy being held out the window, the editor being held out the window. It never happened. It never happened.
It's apocryphal, because like the windows in that office didn't open.
It's also apocryphal because it's either Julie Schwartz or Robert Kanigher, it's Alex Toth, it's Mike Sikowski. There are too many names attached to it.
Did you try to vet these stories to determine the veracity?
No, because it's like it goes back to Men Who Shot Liberty Valance, print the legend. You know, there's a character named Alfred Kessler in the book, who is a combination, who has a backstory that belongs to someone else, which I'll tell you about later, not them, and the front story of another talent. Okay, he figures later. The only avatars in the book that are directly related to the characters that I'm conflating are a character named Sid Mitchell, who was clearly Jack Kirby,
right,
and Bob Rose, who was clearly Stan Lee. And I am of the mind that, pardon me, I've been talking to people at comic book conventions all day today. I started the day as a tenor, I'm now a baritone. I believe, I've said this in public, that Stan Lee was invented by Jack Kirby. That before Jack Kirby came along, before the synergy that existed between these two men happened, Stan was one of hundreds of hacks working in comic books, just basically following every trend. I mean, anecdotally, Stan was regarded as the single best imitator of Kurtzman's war books in the comic book business. When Kurtzman's war books became valid and important and acknowledged as good, Stan did the best knockoff of that stuff. Significantly, most of the EC guys ended up working for Stan after the EC company went belly up. You know, Jack Davis did work for them, things like that. And I think Stan was blindsided by the impact of the work that he did with Jack. And Jack never recovered, and Stan grabbed the moment. Now, I'm not of the mind that Jack did everything and Stan did nothing. This is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there was, like I say, a synergy that existed between these two men, and then existed again with Ditko. And Stan, operating from that terror of what he regarded as a life of failure, chased this dog down and grabbed it. Okay. I also believe that had the poles been reversed, and it had been Jack in the catbird seat and Stan in there, that Jack would have done to Stan exactly what Stan did to Jack. I have no doubt in my mind that it was not a personal failing on Stan's part. It was a generational approach to success.
That was just how things were done.
It's how it was a dog-eat-dog world. Okay. I mean, and I have to say that when I became a working professional, I mean, I discovered the Marvel stuff with Spider-Man, with Amazing Fantasy 15 as a summer camper, and it blew my mind. I just absolutely was astonished by this, because it was comic book characters who were behaving in ways that I'd never seen before, and I really loved it. I know I was a guy who was a devotee of the Julie Schwartz books. I dismissed Mort Weisinger work as just junk. I love Dick Sprang, that kind of shit. And the Jack Kirby, I knew Kirby stuff from Challenge of the Unknown, but I'd never seen this before. It was just amazing. But by the time I started working professionally, my interest in this work had just vanished. I didn't care about it. It was so completely chock-a-block with nothing but impact and violence, with no nuance and no character. And as I say, I was always a reader. My generation came to comics steeped in pulps the way the previous generation had, but also in a lot of marijuana, a lot of LSD, a lot of drinking, and a lot of rock and roll. And you know, when we heard Wooden Ships by Jefferson Airplane, it was like, that's comics. You know, it's narrative. Okay. And my generation earnestly believed we would outlive superhero comic books. I know how ridiculous that sounds to you, but it's true. Because superhero comic books are drawn by men of our father's age. And nothing about them appealed to us in any way. The only member of my generation who would have been available to do that stuff was Rich Buckler. And if Buckler had played an honest game, he could have had a career, but he didn't. So my generation was completely blindsided by the arrival of guys of a couple of years younger than us, who cared about this shit in ways we could never begin to care again. All of us had been fans of this work as kids, but we'd outgrown it. And we now are into a third or fourth generation of men who have never outgrown that taste, which staggers me. Now, anecdotally, as I said, that first impulse, that first layout, what any anecdotes out there, they all came back to me as settling of scores. And I had somebody on Facebook dismiss the book after the third issue came out. He said, I've stopped reading with the second, because there's nothing but settling scores, which I was astonished by. Because significantly, the first arc is about everybody in the first arc is dead. You know, there were a couple of characters.
You kill off your three main characters.
Right, because they're old people. You know, we meet them at the age in their 20s in 1945 when they've been demobilized. Two guys and a girl. The girl has been holding down the fort for them. They come back with portfolios ready to do superhero comic books in 1945, just as the superhero market falls out the bottom, and then they start scrambling. Now, the narrative structure of this book is 1945, 55, 65, and 2001. We see these characters aging and growing, and turning their backs on each other, betraying each other, and behaving the way actual people do. I have no interest in a dramatic form where the best you can do is a variation on a theme, and your narrative structure is basically Roadrunner cartoons, which is what superheroes are, in which characterization is defined by a wound. Like Batman is about a rich guy who had a bad day when he was 8. And that's really about it, and we now suffer the consequences of a 15-year-old boy's idea of how an adult behaves. And the people who drew and wrote this material, generally speaking, had come to the material the same way I did, which is to say a love for the form, and had that love beaten out of them by the experience of making it. Okay, because the capacity for exploitation, the depth of the contempt that the publishers had for the talent pool is profound and deep. It really is. And I wanted to convey that in a comic book form because I'm a comic book man. I responded to the calling. One of the things about people talk, when you get older, you become more conservative. No. I am exactly the same person I was when I was 21 in my presentation and sensibility. The difference is I now have the hat, the horse, and the cattle to go with the attitude. Because when I was in my 20s, in the 1970s, producing work that is shamefully bad, I had nothing to back up my ego. And I now have that product to back up the ego. The problem is that what I regard as good has little or no value in the context of comic books. The comic book reader, for the most part, has a bullet point chart, a checklist of material that, when I hear someone talk about not likable characters, I don't care about likability. Character likability is of no interest. Character interestability interests me. I just binge watched the last 5 episodes of season 2 of Succession, which is a show filled with utterly unlikable people who are profoundly mediocre and stupid, who all think they're smarter than they are. And one of the reasons that many people aren't watching the show is they think it's a drama, and it's not. It's a bleak comedy. And I love that. And I do characters who are self-interested, who are occasionally amoral, who are not necessarily nice. Is that my wife calling?
No, I'm just checking the time.
Good. My wife she texted me, don't call her, she's taking a nap.
It'd be impressive if she called you on my phone. But.
You never know. They have powers. My career has been defined by the only commercial thing I've ever done, seriously commercial thing, was Star Wars in the mid-70s. And the lesson I took from that was understanding that the audience is more interested in the material as a brand than in the talent as the brand. And since we live in a bubble in the comic book business, the dynamic and the metric of comics is, for me, as it affects me personally, is that perhaps there are maybe 250,000 people in the entire United States and Canada buying all the English language comic books we make. Close your eyes for a moment and consider how small that number is. Okay. Now back up and realize that Kevin Feige has monetized to the tune of billions material that 99.99.99% of the people who are buying all those tickets, buying all the tickets, spending all those billions, have no idea exists in its original source material. And the tiniest percentage of those who do don't really give a shit. Okay? There's been no advancement of the form. When Bill Maher went off on comic books last year after Stand-Eye, he wasn't talking about comic books, he was talking about comic book movies. That's where the material exists now. So comic books is like scrimshaw, you know? It's like carving on ivory. It's a tiny little niche business which has been invaded by amateurism. This past Sunday in the New York Times, a woman cartoonist who, I have no idea who she is, did a thing about how to do comic books from an expert. And it was the work of an amateur imbecile. It demonstrated a complete lack of understanding or interest in the fact that there is a visual language and there's a textual language to what we do. This is a reason why this panel is that shape and that and all that stuff. And I learned all that from the people who preceded me. I have absolutely no problem acknowledging the fact that I stand on the shoulders of giants, and some of whom are represented in the context of this book. And the idea of acknowledging one's influences has lost its luster and value, because in a contemporary culture, there seems to be an insistence on being born with knowledge. You know, we all know people who dismiss technology and who approach children. We see children who are adept at technology from birth, without acknowledging the fact that they didn't bring the technology with them from the womb, it was waiting for them. Okay. And so our history as a field is being lost out of a lack of curiosity, an historical amnesia, and an attempt to impose a kind of a Panglossian contemporaneous chauvinism on modern culture. And the idea that, as it is today, like Pangloss is a strawman character in Voltaire's Candide, whose phrasing is, "In this, the best of all possible worlds." And what we now have is a culture that believes that it can judge the past through the scrim and lens of its own experience, without acknowledging the reality that in 5 to 10 years, their children will be looking at their culture and dismissing their culture as fatuous and ridiculous. Because that is what generations do. It's like pop music. Pop music is designed to drive your parents crazy. That's its job. Okay? I listen to music that made my mother's head explode. You know, my children listen to music that I don't understand. And that's its job. It is to divide generations. Okay? And comics, like so much of modern culture, has been invaded by the amateur. And I wanted to put on paper at least the acknowledgement of the existence of a history that had value, that had human culture attached to it. It wasn't about superheroes, it wasn't about the content, it was about the people who made the form. That, I mean, as an adult, I don't read comic books anymore because the material is mostly just not about anything I care about. And the guys who are doing narrative I care about are, generally speaking, very amateurish looking in their presentation. I like professional looking work that's about something and it's really thin on the ground. So I wanted to put on paper before I went off, because I'm careening toward death right now. That's what happens when you get to be my age. So sorry that spoiler alert, I'm gonna die. And I wanted to get down my feelings about people like Gill and like Ramona Fradon and like Flo Steinberg and like Wallace Wood, and just remind people that this work has history and that it deserves attention and value. What I found interesting is that my life has been defined by its relationship with the zeitgeist. And within a month of this book coming out, I started seeing all these other books that hinged on the same thing. And I found it fascinating. I mean, I've always been one step ahead of the curve. I feel like I can smell the future, but can't profit from it. And you know, so I'm into the second arc now, and which is about my generation.
I was about to ask about that because it's a very noticeable omission in the first series.
Oh, yeah.
Because you have 45, 55,